Okay, so I'm sure many of you know Adrian, but I'm still going to go ahead and give him a proper introduction. Adrian Blackwell is an artist and urban designer who teaches architecture at the University of Waterloo. His artwork focuses on the antagonisms and inequalities of existing public and urban spaces. Influenced by anarchist political philosophy, he creates physical spaces of equality and communication. Since 1998, he's been making a sequence of evolving works titled Model for a Public Space, which have shown at artist-run centers and galleries across Canada and in the US. The latest of these are Scaffold and Horizons, Earth and Sky, for the opening year of Toronto's Museum of Contemporary Art, and Isonomion in Toronto, for the 2019 Toronto Biennale of Art. Adrian has exhibited at the 2005 Shenzhen and 2011 Chengdu Biennales, and Mirror Circles for Beijing was installed in the 2015 Shanghai Urban Space Art Season. At the 2019 Chicago Architecture Biennale, he made an architectural library against the erasure of Chicago's common spaces to bring together publications curated by 20 activist organizations working to preserve the city's common spaces. Adrian's view here in this conversation is critical. Guided by his anarchist and activist values, I know many of us are inspired by his continual challenging of architecture's sometimes limited and prescriptive role. As a teacher, he helps students bridge the gap between thinking and acting. Adrian, you're our last speaker, so I'm just going to hand it off to you.
Thanks very much, Vic. And thanks very much to John, Grace, and Crystal for your talks. It's been great to see this work. So I'm going to share my screen. Am I sharing? Yeah. How do I play now? Okay. So I'm going to talk about two teaching instances where I've taught about housing, and two collaborations that I've done in over the last year and a bit that are about making affordable housing in Toronto. And I'm going to start, I just started with this diagram here, which I put together for a talk in Chicago around the library that I made there. And it made me think, I was thinking about the right to housing. And I started to think about three things that I think are really essential in housing. One of them is collective power. That is, like, I think people need to have power over the spaces that they live in. And they need to have that power not by themselves, because cities are big places with lots of people. So they need to have power collectively with other people at different scales. They need to have power over in the city. They have to have power in their neighborhood. They have to have power over the building that they live in. And they have to have power within their homes as well. And everybody has to have that power, which means that it needs to be collective. I think that housing also needs to have a sense of generosity. That is, it needs to give people more than their basic needs. It needs to be somehow expansive. And I think architects are very interested in that problem. And then finally, I think, and I think all of these three things are intertwined, but I think that people need to be able to self-fashion their homes. They need to be able to make their homes according to their desires. And that's a kind of power, but it's also a way in which housing has to be flexible. It has to be able to allow for people's transformation. When I first came to Waterloo in 2012, the first studio that I taught was a housing studio, and I called it the Grand Domestic Revolution. And of course, I was inspired by Dolores Hayden's book from 1983 called The Grand Domestic Revolution, which is an incredible history, essentially, of co-housing. It's not the word she uses that often, but she's interested in the way in which women came up with amazing ideas to transform the home as industry started to transform cities. So in response to the industrialization of everyday life and the alienation of women within homes, women remade and rethought housing to create more collective living spaces. And I knew of this book, but I was partly inspired to think about this as a title by an exhibition in Utrecht curated by Bina Choi and Maiko Tanaka, called The Grand Domestic Revolution Goes On. And it was an exhibition which really inspired me because it tried to rethink the Grand Domestic Revolution in relation to contemporary capitalism, in relation to post-Fordist neoliberal capitalism, and its emphasis on individuality and the privatization of just about everything. So they thought, well, this is a good moment for us to rethink this idea of a grand domestic revolution. These are a couple of illustrations from Dolores Hayden's book. One, Jane Addams' Hull House in Chicago, with its dining room. And I think it's interesting, the kitchen in this diagram is even much, much bigger than the dining room. But an incredible institution in which was about helping immigrants, but also about people living collectively and creating a social institution which included collective living. And then this interesting project by Leonard E. Ladd from 1890, both of these are 19th century examples, in which houses shared a single kitchen in the middle of the block. So a lot of Dolores Hayden's ideas have to do with this sharing of kitchens and sharing of common spaces, this common room that Grace talked about and showed so beautifully in the projects that she illustrated. So the first project of the term was to try to find already existing co-housing in Toronto. And there aren't that many examples that I know of kind of architect design co-housing. So students were matched up with different projects which built co-housing informally. This is a warehouse near Cherry Beach in the Portlands, which is almost a totally industrial area. And in it, a group of artists who formed a collective called Versus 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 created a kind of co-housing in which they lived and worked together. And they did it within a large warehouse space and created 2 levels within a single piece of housing. So a group of students, Elizabeth, Maddie, Jake, Clara, Derek, went there, visited the space, and drew this space. I think they're quite beautiful drawings that show the kind of nesting of living and working, especially these detailed shots of a single unit in which sleeping lofts are superimposed on top of working areas. And people are intertwined and interlocked in this space. And obviously one of the reasons they're doing this is simply because it's affordable. It's partly a necessity, but also something which generated for them a really great degree of creativity. Clara continued this as everybody in the studio developed their own individual design projects with a project called Negotiation Space. And it's in the western suburbs, just on the edge of the city of Cambridge. And it was an attempt to create dense rural housing with clusters of units. So I don't know if you can, where's my cursor here? I can't even see my cursor, so maybe it's not going to work. But in the red box, in the center of the red box, there's a dining and kitchen area. And at the very upside of the red box, there's a dining area. And then clustering around it are 3 units. Actually, there are 5 units, but only the 3 that touch the center box are part of that cluster. And so those 3 units, which are actually each interlocked, then share this one kitchen area. So you can see in the section, it negotiates different grade. And here you can see the interlocking of units. The red is the shared kitchen and dining. And there are 6 units that wrap around each of these red units. And within the whole complex, the building on the right-hand side is about childcare. And so it was a place that people, and working in childcare. So it was a place in which working, childcare, and collective living could happen together. So earlier in 2019, I was approached by members of the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty to try to create an image for a building that could replace 7 empty lots on Sherbourne Street. And I talked with a number of former students from the University of Waterloo, Mona Dai, Sneha Sumanth, and Matthew Lawson. And Mona was a part of a group called Open Architecture Collaborative Toronto, which is a nonprofit organization that is interested in helping activist organizations with architectural services. And together we worked with OCAP to kind of create a vision for a site that they felt the city should expropriate. And so we worked over a number of months, and we produced at the end a document called a community-driven development proposal for public housing at 214 to 230 Sherbourne Street. But the project was a process. And it takes place in the downtown east. And for architects, the downtown east is a space which has a long history of architectural activism. So it was a place that I was very interested in working in. These are two drawings by Diamond and Myers architects from the 1970s, showing what they saw was the threat of high-rise gentrification in downtown neighborhoods in the 1970s. They produced interesting housing that was low-rise, called infill housing, that would fit into the neighborhood as a response to that. But in the intervening many decades, this threat has become even more real. And when we looked at the site on Sherbourne Street, we saw three different threats of gentrification over the last 25 years. In the mid-1990s, the city rezoned industrial land on either side of the center city in the Two Kings. And the eastern half of the Two Kings is directly south of the site OCAP wanted to expropriate. And its transformation has significantly gentrified the area to the south. The area to the east has been significantly gentrified by the redevelopment of Regent Park. My box is a little offset for some reason, but the Regent Park is Canada's largest and oldest public housing project, and its redevelopment into a mixed-use housing development has significantly increased real estate prices in the neighborhood and created a lot of for-profit housing in this area. And then finally, to the west along Yonge Street, the condo boom that started in the early 2000s, but really accelerated after 2010, has been steadily marching eastward. So this site is under great threat of gentrification. And so we, first of all, looked at what would be allowable on the site, and this is the allowable zoning envelope, and then proposed three different quick sketches of different ideas, different for one main reason, that we wanted to take them to the community to see what they thought would make the most sense. And we got feedback from about 100 people. And we worked with, the people that we met with were people who lived in the neighborhood. And at each meeting, we've supplied food. We had one evening meeting where there was a dinner. And we had one lunchtime meeting with homeless people at a drop-in center at the corner of Dundas and Sherbourne, right near the site. And they provided different kinds of feedback. And in the end, we produced a design that came out of that. And you can see that it's a very dense building. And it's designed to essentially meet the scale of the condominiums that are threatening this site. And so it's not an infill project like these small projects that Diamond and Myers tried to do to really fit into the neighborhood, but it builds in density. And at the same time, it tries to fit into adjacent buildings by having a low-rise podium. So the low-rise podium is a kind of infill building and the tower sits on top, but the podium is carved out to bring the public in, and all the ground floor is filled with public programs that are catering to the homeless community in the neighborhood. So the idea was to create a kind of bastion against gentrification. It got some considerable press, and we took it to council. We presented at council on different occasions. OCAP marshaled many different people to depute in favor of it. But as a group of designers, we also deputed. And as a group of designers, we organized a letter specifically for the design community to get over 200 signatures of planners, architects, professionals, and academics to support the expropriation of these 7 lots for social housing. And at the 2017 council meeting in 2019, the city basically agreed to initiate negotiations to acquire the properties. I mean, they have a lot of outs of this, and we have to keep on top of them to make this happen. But I think it was nonetheless it was a good outcome from this kind of political pressure on the city to expropriate this these empty abandoned lots, which have been sitting there for more than a decade. More recently, in a building called 17 Patton Road, a set of artists started organizing in the fall to try to figure out what would happen when their landlords finally decided to sell the building. And I used to live in this building, and I worked with the tenants from the beginning, just doing small things like helping organize meetings. And they organized all the tenants in the building to try to think about how a different form of housing could be created. Unfortunately, they were forced into an evacuation order a week before the COVID-19 lockdown. And they were terrified at the thought of having to move during that lockdown. And they intensified their mobilization, making this public petition on change.org. This is the building, and this is one of the key organizers, Claude Whitman. But Claude, Dorota, Alex, Jennifer, and the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust have been working together to try to organize tenants to turn this into a cooperative. And the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, many of you may know, is an incredible organization in downtown Toronto West, which politicizes the neighborhood and organizes tenants in the neighborhood in a number of different ways, but it also is beginning to own different pieces of land in which it provides affordable housing. So this is one of their first houses, which is a rooming house. And in Parkdale, there are many rooming houses. Their intention is to save these buildings for affordable housing. So the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust was interested in saving this artist housing. Jane Hutton, another professor in this faculty, and I worked together to draw a basic egress plan, because the reason, I'm moving through things rather quickly, but the reason that they're being evacuated is from the city itself, because the fire egress is not up to code. There's only one exit from many apartments in the building. And so these corridors that we've drawn basically just connect the two egresses in the most minimal, simple way possible, with as few walls being torn down. So the Star wrote an article about this, and following this, there was quite a debate. Anna Bailau was a part of, was meeting with the tenants for a while, but obviously the tenants were angry at the landlords for not doing what they had to do to fix the fire issues. And they were angry at the city for evacuating them on such short notice. But they've had a stay of evacuation itself because of COVID-19. And here's a set of letters. So this letter says, Councillor Anna Bailau must step up for artists facing eviction at 17 Patton Road. I like this little luxury condo starting at 1.1 million in the corner here. That's what you see on the website. And then Anna Bailau, our councillor, or the councillor for this neighborhood, and also the deputy mayor, and also the head of the Toronto Affordable Housing Committee, says, as a councillor, I'm working on a solution for 17 Patton Road. So in fact, the city has come up with $2.8 million and is very interested in working with the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust to make this into a cooperative. The problem right now is the landlord, and they've got dollar signs in their eyes, and they can imagine making a lot of money off this sale. So it's not a sure thing by any means, but there's been a lot of work by the tenants to organize to save affordable housing in the city, which is such a rare resource. So the final project I wanted to talk about is this studio, which just wrapped up, which a few of you who are here participated in. The studio was called Our House is on Fire, Confronting Toronto's Housing and Climate Emergencies. And I taught it with Sandrina Kramar, Marie-Paul McDonald, Derek Revington, and Jonathan Terrell. And I think, I know Nicole is here and Devin Arndt were our teaching assistants. And if you want to find out more, you can see on Bridge, the Bridge website has a couple of posts about different aspects of the studio. But the post is called, like the title of this talk, Towards an Architecture of Relation. And there are two quotes at the beginning, one by Lugigu Patrick Stewart, who's a West Coast Niska architect, and who's done some kind of amazing housing for Indigenous children and their families. And he says, one's relationship to land is spiritual. There has to be respect for all creation, understanding that everything is animate. You're talking about the rocks, the grandfathers. You're talking about the trees. You're talking about the water, the air. In Western thinking, they make the distinction between animate and inanimate. If inanimate objects exist, they're there for the taking. Nobody owns them. And to me, this has led to the destruction of the land, to water, to resources. But there needs to be respect for everything. So I think we were trying to think about how housing can act in a network of relations, both ecological relations, but also social relations. In the course outline, we were interested in addressing the problem of residential alienation and the way in which residential alienation is very strongly tied to housing status as a commodity. It says in the course outline, at a fundamental level, residential alienation is related to the threefold alienation of primitive accumulation. That is the early period of capitalism when countries and capitalists and colonizers took what they needed from people to make money, stole from people through slavery, through colonization, through other kinds of original sins and ongoing sins of capitalism. It's an alienation from the ecological milieu of the land that a housing occupies, from the social world that surrounds its inhabitants, and from the ability to make housing according to one's own desires. This alienation is fundamentally tied to housing status as a commodity whose exchange value comes to dominate its use value, and whose value as a product of human labor is alienated from the user. So we tried to think this through in a set of buildings which were affordable housing, but they were deeply affordable housing that would have to be financed by the government. That was the basic demand. And so essentially the studio also works along Sherborne, and it takes a set of sites. If the project that we did with the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty was for one site along Sherborne, we looked at 4 other sites which are either publicly owned or currently abandoned, and tried to think about how housing could animate these sites, transform them. And so this first example is by Melody Chen, and I'm really focusing in this presentation on the housing dimension rather than the ecological dimension. But she builds 2 large buildings. The students really were challenged to build dense structures, which would add a lot of housing to the neighborhood. But I'm going to concentrate here on the plans of the units. And the common space outside. I mean, I think one of the things that's really beautiful in this particular housing project is the porch. So some of these, on the left-hand side, you have double height units. On the right-hand side, you have single height units. But in each of them, in front of the unit, there's a very wide corridor in a glass atrium. And those are what I really like about this is the way that these corridors change their shape and change their perforations throughout the corridor. And you can see this very beautifully in this section. You have to kind of look hard at the left-hand side of the building in this image, but you can see the way there's this movement of these gaps that let light and communication between different levels in these corridors that access the units. And part of this is about cross ventilation. And you can see here a double height unit and the single height units above. But it creates this amazing social space. It's an apartment building, but these corridors animate and create social space for all the residents. This is Nicole Chen's project, which is similar in many ways, but is also very beautifully done. And it shares, I think, in many ways, some of the same ideas. But in this case, the corridor is on the north side and balconies are on the south side of the building. Sorry, this is rotated. So north is to your right in this image. But you can see different two-bedroom, two-bedroom, or a number of two-bedroom units, a number of four-bedroom units. And in each of these, they have a balcony and there's all this common space in the corridor, and the common space is also perforated. So I really like this section where you have a similar kind of ventilation scheme where ventilation can run right through the unit, but you get these double height spaces in the corridor. And this is an elevation of the balcony, but I love the way the layering of space creates these different kinds of spaces at different levels through the section. This is Madeline Kim's project. And hers is very interesting in its planning. Here we have a set of what might be called Unfalad rooms, so rooms without corridors. And part of her idea, you can see in the two different plans, could be of the same floor at different times. You can rearrange the units so you can add these squares or subtract these squares. So I think she's thinking in a very interesting way about this idea about people having agency over their units. Not that you can transform them easily when somebody lives next door, but you have this possibility of shaping space. And here are some of the variations she's imagined. And Anna Suprika's project, Room to Grow, does something quite similar. You can see on the right-hand side, she creates a set of units in which 3 different families, or possibly even more, have units that then share spaces in between. So there's kind of what I would call a kind of urbanism of the unit, where the private spaces form public spaces. So the kitchen, the dining, and different kinds of living and studying spaces are shared by 6 units in a, so you can see it more clearly here. This is a zoom in on one of the units. But so this is a really explicit example of co-housing in a multi-height, multi-story building. And then finally, Artie Chang's project does something similar, uses a similar plan typology here with double height spaces, as he calls them, growing areas that look out at a park. But you can see from the section that there are double height spaces on every floor, and every floor you can access the bottom or the top of a double height space at different sides of the building. And again, this plan is similar to Anna's in the sense that private units then create shared spaces in between them. And in Artie's, you can actually pull back the walls of your living room within your private unit and open it to the common shared areas of the building. And so that's the end of that studio. And I just wanted to show one image from Val Runemary's first year master's studio. This is Mobini Hanea's project for co-housing on St. Clair Avenue, just to illustrate that these ideas are not only in a few studios at the University of Waterloo, but I think different people are implementing them in different studios. So I think there's an interesting culture of investigation of ideas about co-housing in the school. Thanks.